Hello, I'm Carwyn Jones, and welcome to this series of podcasts where I'll be talking to movers and shakers in the Welsh economy. What makes them tick? What's their background? And what's their view on the future of business and, of course, of Wales itself? I'm joined today by Ben Cottam. Ben is the Head of External Affairs for the Federation of Small Businesses Cymru. Ben, you're very welcome.
Hello.
Now, Ben, many people will know what the FSB is, but there'll be some I know who are not aware of what it does. So give us an explanation of the organisation that you work for.
So FSB is the largest business organisation in the UK. In Wales, we have around 10,000 members. So they are everything from a sole trader, single operating business, right up to someone employing 250 individuals. So a really big spectrum of the Welsh economy. In fact, obviously, SMEs and micro businesses make up the vast majority of business stock of the Welsh economy. So our job is, I guess, threefold. One, to campaign and to raise the issues that small businesses see and feel in the environment, to create networks, to bring businesses together, to create opportunity, and we provide services, commercial services, to support those businesses. So there's three sort of central planks to what FSB does. We've been established 45 years, so there's a lot of pedigree in the landscape. And in Wales, we've had a very, very active presence since the coming of devolution in 1999, so very ingrained into the landscape. And through the sort of combination, I guess, of the work that I do and my team do, as in partnership with our members and volunteers across Wales, the idea is just to, I guess, bring the richness of the conversation about the SME landscape and what needs to be done to make that thrive.
Now, you're the Head of External Affairs. What does that involve?
I guess my job is to sort of knit together a lot of FSB's activity in Wales, but chiefly I'm the contact point for senior decision makers within Welsh Government and within the UK Government in Wales. So I guess, I will lead the policy operation, FSB campaigns on discrete issues that are decided and put through the filter of our policy unit of members. So we campaign on issues, but also just to make sure that there is enough noise in the landscape about what SMEs are doing to make sure that that is high up in the news agenda and to make sure that, we have early warning on any issues that are rising within the economy and play our part in reacting to those and supporting, for instance, Welsh Government in reacting to those.
So Ben, tell us about your personal journey, how you got to where you are now and your experience over the last few years.
So I'm a farmer's son from Pembrokeshire, born and brought up in the county, and like many, came to Cardiff to university. I graduated from the School of Journalism at Cardiff University, and that sort of coincided with the coming of devolution, coming of the Assembly. So I was fortunate enough to go and work as political staff in the Assembly. And I think that was really fascinating. The early days of devolution, I think I likened it to, I think everyone was standing around saying, right, we've got this thing, how do we work? And it was really interesting to see.
The first year was lively.
Yeah, the first year absolutely was lively. And I guess then, sort of following working in the Assembly, I actually, I had a previous incarnation at FSB and in a policy role. And then from there on in, what I've done is worked within various business representative groups. So I guess very much dependent in some way on devolution. You're very close to the workings of the Senedd and Welsh Government. I'm very passionate actually about populating that conversation about how business relates to the institution and what the institution means to business. So I've been very fortunate to sort of have roles that both, sort of interest and sort of stimulate me, but I feel as though I've been able to make some kind of some kind of contribution to the conversation around business. So it has been a really fascinating journey. I think one of the best things about Wales is the proximity of the networks. It might seem a little, to some from the outside, it might seem like it's a bubble, around the Assembly. But actually one of the benefits is the closeness of the networks. And I think that is one of the greatest assets of Wales, the opportunity to bring people together to respond to, crises or to respond to the call to grow the economy. So there are many familiar faces around the networks of business and representative organisations, but I think I think that proximity is probably helpful. We probably underrated and the value of having that kind of network. So it's been a really fascinating journey, and it's something that provides me, I guess, day in day out with a lot of variety. and the job that I've got with FSB, given the breadth of our membership, it's a cliche to say no 2 days are the same, but it's the breadth of that membership and the breadth of the issues that they face, and the stories are absolutely fascinating. So I find that really motivating.
Now, when we talk about SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, it's a well-known phrase. Everybody uses it. But how do we define an SME? When does an SME stop being an SME?
Well, technically speaking, once a business employs over 250 employees, but the vast majority of business in Wales are actually micro businesses employing under 10 employees. I think what we've been focusing on in FSB in the last 2 years is focusing on what we call the missing middle, or what some might know on the continent as the Mittelstand.
Mittelstand in German, Mittelstanden, isn't it? German,
yeah, yes. Absolutely. And we don't have enough of that stock in Wales. And I guess our assessment is that if we were to grow that provides a slightly more stable economy or a stable stock of businesses. What those businesses inherently do, they stimulate growth in other businesses. They create sort of grounded and supply chain opportunities for smaller businesses. So Wales has a vulnerability in not having enough of those businesses. So I think we're keen to work with government and others to see, well, what's the characteristics of those businesses? If you understand it as business growth as a set of steps, for instance, where are some steps bigger than others? And then that's where we aim our interventions and support to help those businesses grow. Now, the other characteristic is many of them, when they do grow, spin out of Wales. So once they grow, how do we retain them in Wales? And how do we retain that benefit? Now, they're no less ambitious than any other growth business. So I think we need to understand better what their needs are and understand better the opportunities of growing those sorts of businesses, because I don't see any lack of ambition among businesses. It's often cited that businesses in Wales aren't ambitious enough, and I don't see any lack of that at all when I talk to businesses. What I do see, though, is some commonalities in the things that get in the way of growth.
Have you seen an increase in entrepreneurial activity over the past 10, 20 years, would you say?
I think there has been. I think, clearly, we've seen a rise in self-employment within the economy. Is a significant rise in self-employment. Part of that, there is a big debate as to what proportion of that is the rise in what you might call false self-employment, there's, I guess, the darker ends of the gig economy. But we undertook an assessment and found that actually the proportion of that in Wales is really quite small. So I think when we assessed the rise in self-employment, it was very much positively driven by an entrepreneurial drive. So I think there is opportunity. There's no shortage of talent there. I guess the challenge for us is about how we, when someone starts a business, how we get them over the line in year sort of 3 or 4, make sure it's relatively easy to start a business, to develop that business, even if you don't grow it in employment terms, but to get that business over the line in years 3 and 4 and to create that sustainability is a far more difficult task. So I think we need focus on that. But part of my role is to make sure that all those great entrepreneurial stories are told and heard.
You mentioned the Mittelstand model that the Germans have. My perception of the Welsh economy was that it was a pyramid of businesses of different sizes, but it was a pretty flat pyramid. You had a very, very broad base of smaller businesses, a handful of large businesses that were public companies, and then the Mittelstand, as it were, wasn't really there in the middle. So what could we do to inflate that pyramid, to make it taller, if I can put it that way? How do we encourage a middle-sized business economy? What do you think would help in that regard?
So these understanding the pains that businesses face in that growth story. So some of it might be the suitability of premises. So in the work that we undertook, there was one of the common stories was, I can get to such and such a size, but there aren't the suitable premises locally to allow that growth. So it may well be that the business moves out of that community or out of Wales at all. So that's one of the things. It's making sure that we've got suitable finance for their needs as well. We've got we've got a great raft of finance opportunities now through things like the Development Bank of Wales for SMEs and helping SME growth. But I think when you get to a certain size, there are sort of bespoke needs of businesses, things like patient capital, that sort of long-term perspective on finance, which quite often is lacking in the commercial market and certainly is quite patchy regionally throughout the UK. But also, obviously, there are the things that we would all recognise from any business growth story, things like the availability of suitable skill sets in localities. Now, every area of Wales, we are not going to tool it up to be, the same as, the urban areas of Wales, for instance. However, I think what our assessment is that we should, as best as we can, create the wherewithal for a business, even in a rural economy, to grow and sustain itself within that economy. There will be limitations to that, but I think that, we know that where these businesses grow and thrive, particularly in non-urban economies, they have a disproportionately positive effect on that economy and can create that local supply chain. So I think we need to understand the growth story and need to understand the infrastructure that needs to be put into place. What I would say, though, is it is a pyramid. Business can't thrive entirely on SMEs. We need that ecosystem. So I think part of the vulnerability of larger businesses has been they've been remotely, they've been headquartered elsewhere. By and large, they're not Welsh headquartered businesses. And there are some instances where they've been internationally mobile. But we need that ecosystem. So, something like Aston Martin, for instance, as long as that asset can be capitalized and made to create local supply chains, local skill sets, then I think there are real opportunities in that, both for the economy and SMEs. So it's not an either-or story. I think we would say, as an organisation, it's about having a proportional gaze on the opportunities of small business growth and medium-sized business growth.
You mentioned a little earlier about the tendency in Wales, the greater tendency in Wales perhaps, of businesses to grow to a certain size and then sell to a larger competitor. More so perhaps, it seems, than happens elsewhere in the UK and other countries. And that leads, of course, to us being underrepresented on the AIM, underrepresented on the stock exchange, given our population. Is there a cultural issue there, do you think? Because one of the things that we looked at some years ago is whether we could reawaken the Cardiff Stock Exchange, which became dormant in 1973. And would that help? Would it mean that more companies would look to become, more businesses rather, would look to become public companies in the future? Was there an issue with London? Was it seen as being too big a hurdle to overcome? In your experience, what have you found? What would help those medium-sized businesses who are ready to make that jump to actually do it rather than sell?
I think a lot of it is one of the conversations we had with it was a retail company employing around 120 people. Now, when we sat down and spoke to them, we said, "Well, what's the next step in the growth of this business?" And the response was, "Well, we know we'll sell, and we'll know who we sell to." And it was a big UK chain. And there was almost an inevitability. The conversation hadn't arrived on their landscape as to how do we grow this in Wales? And I think part of the problem is that there isn't the visibility, A, of support and B, opportunity. So, the angel investment network in Wales is pretty underdeveloped. And so that's part of that infrastructure that is needed within any healthy economy to grow these businesses. But it's also having the networks that talk about growth, that talk about the opportunities of growing those medium-sized firms and making sure the infrastructure is around them. So I think some people see the inevitability of selling out, and many are really pained by it. Some others are very comfortable with it because they've thought of nothing else. So it's having the conversation, being visible and having that conversation visible, having the examples and the best practice visible to them, but also making sure that we are close enough when that question comes, that we are quite close enough, whether it be FSB, whether it be Welsh Government, whether it be Development Bank or whoever else, that we are close enough to that conversation that it is seen as an opportunity and a possibility. But I think too often there is the inevitability of, well, obviously we'll sell up or obviously we'll sort of spin out. So I think it is making more noise about the opportunities of remaining within Wales and having the infrastructure in there to help those businesses grow.
Do you think there's an element of a feeling of being a part of a branch economy in Wales sometimes? If I look at Scotland, the economy there is much stronger in terms of homegrown companies. You have the distillers, you have the banks, of course. True that a lot of them have been taken over by now, but they do have a Scottish identity that means they won't leave Scotland. Ireland even more so. For example, the agri-food sector in Ireland is enormous compared to what we have in Wales. And in those countries, people don't necessarily think, well, what we want to do is grow the business to a certain size and then sell it. Now, I can understand people doing that. Of course, if you're offered a lot of money, then the temptation is to take it. But is that part of the thinking, that somehow eventually you will sell to a bigger organisation based in London, perhaps, in a way that doesn't happen in the same way in Scotland or in Ireland?
I don't think it's an inevitability of it. I mean, as I say, I see no shortage of businesses that are determined to thrive and grow in Wales and have a real, what we can capitalise on is a real commitment to Wales as a nation, as a country, and as an economy. We day in, day out come across people who say, look, I'm here because, the skills are great. I want to support, I want to be part of this community. I live in this community. My family have grown up in this community. It's important for me to remain here. I think there is a sense, though. I mean, we have a very different border with England. So I think attitudinally, there's a different conversation than maybe there is in Scotland. There's a different sense of maybe national identity. But I think, we are a little bit meek in the story about business growth in Wales. And I think there is a call to action to be more ambitious and to say, how do we answer the question? How do we be part of the solution about growing businesses and containing them within Wales? It isn't about being parochial. It's not being, we talk a lot about sort of indigenous growth, but it's not. It's about Welsh growth. We don't want to be too parochial about it. We don't want to be too inward looking. These businesses are no less internationally ambitious than any other business. So we need to populate the conversation to say it can be all those things, but in Wales, but with that base in Wales. And I think, we do need to be a little bit more gutsy about how we populate the conversation. Wales is a very proud nation full of very proud entrepreneurs. We probably haven't answered the question yet about what's the environment, what environment can we create that helps them answer that question about growing that business in Wales. And I think that is, that is one of pride, but it's also one of practical questions about making sure that we join up better, that we have that infrastructure as skills, finance, property that answers the question for them. It creates the inevitability that they would obviously grow in Wales.
So what would you say are the challenges now for SMEs? What are they facing at the moment, and what do they foresee as being future challenges?
The inevitable one is Brexit.
Took us 20 minutes to get to that.
Yeah, it was pretty good going to have lasted that long. It's the immediate challenge, but it's for many businesses, it's unsure as to how long that challenge will last. It is very, very difficult. We know very difficult for businesses to plan even in the immediate term. And we see then a constriction of growth. We are seeing a sort of dropping of confidence levels. So we need to get some early resolution as to what that picture would look like. Beyond Brexit, though, I think there are some real positive opportunities to sort of restart that conversation about sort of entrepreneurial growth. I think we particularly need to focus in those areas that don't have the light shone on them at the moment. So we have the growth deals, the city and growth deals. There's a lot of focus on particularly Cardiff, Swansea, and North Wales. I think there is a feeling in some areas of Wales that they are left out of the conversation. So we need to make sure that we are servicing the conversation in my home patch of Pembrokeshire, for instance, where way out west. Well, what are the opportunities of growing SMEs in economies like that? Because we're not short of dynamic and ambitious businesses in those economies. Now, clearly, we have within Wales a tourism economy that could be really well capitalised. As an economy, it's really dynamic. It is badly joined up. I think we probably don't join the dots in the tourism economy. There are only so many Bluestones or Zip Worlds, and growing more businesses like that and working out, well, how do we create that 365-day-a-year proposition for the tourism economy? Because that actually can deliver in quite a lot of value. How do we create careers out of tourism rather than seasonal jobs? So there's a real opportunity, again, with those small networks, to figure that out and to say, well, what measures are needed in place for that? Manufacturing, despite all the gloom and there's desperately sad stories like the withdrawal of Ford from Bridgend, still a thriving sector, and particularly in the SME economy, we see a lot of manufacturers that are really innovative in manufacturing processes. So organisations like FSB need to talk more about those organisations and lift them up and, as exemplars. I think we are facing a reality that heavy industry has long been in decline. That doesn't assume the inevitability of it withdrawing from Wales, but I think the assumption that it will always be a significant proportion of the Welsh economy, we can't count on that. So within those smaller businesses, how do we make sure that they are dynamic, they are exporting, they are innovating? We recently held an event where we focused on innovation, and some of the examples that we use. River Simple up in Llandrindod, sort of leading the way in the conversation about alternative forms of motoring, sort of a hydrogen-powered car, and that's a leading edge business in a rural economy. So some really good success stories that aren't meek, but are innovating and leading that conversation. But we need more of those, and we need to talk more about those. So I think there are opportunities. I think we need to transition, though, away from the assumption of large-scale industrial, large-scale industry driving the Welsh economy, and that is a very, very painful process, as we know.
It is, and getting the balance right between foreign direct investment and growing local businesses is a balance that's not always easy to strike, of course. But one of the issues that has been raised for many, many years, and you've alluded to it yourself today, is that of access to capital. It's often been said that UK banks are too conservative for the small c and are not willing to lend to businesses that have the opportunity possibly to thrive, but perhaps are a little bit riskier than those that they traditionally fund. Do you find, is that still the case with the lending banks? And with the development bank, how does that help in terms of being able to overcome what's seen as a traditional barrier in accessing capital?
Yeah, it is still the case. And to be fair, I think the development bank have made a really strong play of stepping into that space of gap finance. But I think there needs to be challenge issued to the mainstream lenders that doesn't get them out of jail. They have to step up. What we see, particularly if you take something like house building, and obviously Development Bank have a house building fund. Part of the reason that is there is because the experience of our members in that area is that actually decision making on finance, on loans and finance facilities looks very different in Wales than it does in other areas of the UK, even for the same bank. And so the remote nature of, management of business relationships with banks and the remote nature of decision making means that arbitrarily banks are making decisions about Wales that they might not make elsewhere. Now we have to challenge that at every turn, because it makes the assumption that business in Wales and growth in Wales is a far less profitable enterprise than it would be elsewhere. Now, patently not the case, and I think we have to challenge that. In the meantime, in credit to the Development Bank, the experience of our members of the Development Bank is actually very, very positive. But there is a danger that we lean so heavily on the Development Bank that they're seen as the answer for everything. There will be a limitation even for the Development Bank. So we need to challenge the mainstream funders on these things, because they have to be a part of growing the Welsh economy, but they have to recognise their role in helping to grow the Welsh economy.
One of the things I've noticed over the years is that many of the banks have moved their decision-making operations out of Wales. Not just local branch managers, but the movement of larger Welsh headquarters to elsewhere, and those decision-making processes being taken out of Wales. What sort of effect has that had on SMEs, do you think?
Well, removes part of that infrastructure that we mentioned earlier that is really necessary to help business growth. What you see is there's no shortage of business development activity. You've got some very active business development managers, which then hand over to remote operations once that customer's bought in. But what we need is almost business relationship management. We need them to be more actively gathering intelligence, obviously for their own business, but also sharing that intelligence with government and others, organisations like the Development Bank, so we get that picture as to what business in Wales looks like. But I think even the loss of some of the high street branches disproportionately affects SMEs, and SMEs are really feeling the pain of it. And for a community, I think just the sense that that financial institution is moving out of your community, it says a lot about the ambition for your community or the lack of ambition for your community. So it hurts. The withdrawal of these facilities hurt.
Now, Ben, I want you to imagine that we're here in 10 years' time. I'll be in my 60s, you'll still be a young man. But what will the SME sector look like? Where are the opportunities for growth, do you think, in the SME sector?
I think clearly there are opportunities if we maximise the capacity to innovate. We've got some big productivity challenges within the Welsh economy. It is easy to look at things like artificial intelligence and automation as real threats, but also they're real opportunities. And I think clearly we need to encourage SMEs to innovate more. I think we need to better understand what innovation means. It's very easy to look at sort of new to market innovation, but even if you are let's say you're an accountancy business and you adopt a significant automated process, or it might be a new sort of client interface, then that is innovation. That is innovation to your business, and it addresses some of those questions about what productivity means for you. So businesses need to look at sort of how they answer individually that productivity question, and we need to stop obsessing about innovation being high tech. And only for fast growth businesses, because it's for every business, but it need not be glamorous, it need not be sexy. So I think we need to address those questions. But should we do that, I think there are real opportunities. And at our event, recently, we did profile some of those just to really say a lot of this is already happening in Wales, but a lot of it below the radar. So, a job for an organisation like SME is to lift up those examples and stimulate conversation in the rest of the SME communities about what that looks like for them. But I think, there are needs to, encourage SMEs to export as well. And one of the examples we use is a company in Newport called Syntec. Now, it's an engineering company. So a very, I say traditional company probably doesn't consider itself as traditional, but it's got a revolutionary approach to structural underpinning. Now that company is quite literally pinning up the pyramids. So we have a Welsh-based company that through its engineering expertise is keeping the pyramids up and is underpinning the some of the, for instance, the Indian railway infrastructure. So it's a huge success story that we need to tell. We need to tell more people about. So, stimulating more of those sorts of conversations and those sorts of stories is really important. I'm quite optimistic. I think, clearly we need to get a resolution of the conversation about Brexit and what that means. But over and above that, as I said earlier, I see no lack of ambition within Welsh businesses. There's no lack of businesses that are utterly committed to Wales. What we have to do collectively is create the wherewithal for them to continue that. But I think there are some really good opportunities. One of the things that we do, I mentioned earlier, the proximity of the networks is a real asset. I have this phrase, the complacency of proximity. So it is great to say, well, we are close to maybe Cardiff University, and we've got great links. But do we actually, sort of sweat those links? Do we actively make sure that those live day in, day out to deliver into the Welsh economy? So I suppose the nearest easy comparison, I could live next to Disneyland but never go there because I know at any time I could. So I think being close is not good enough. Being close and capitalising on being close is what we need to do next.
The complacency of proximity. You heard it here first. You should trademark that one, definitely. And then finally, Wales in, let's say, 10 years' time. Where would you want to see Wales in terms of its economy and in terms of the way it presents itself to the world?
Brand is a big issue. And when we talk to our members, brand is a really big issue. And there's a real thirst for better understanding, better owning that brand, actually, among SMEs and projecting that internationally. What we've had in the last 20 years is the start of a defining about what Wales means to itself, what Wales means to the rest of the UK, and what potentially Wales means to the rest of the world. We are a little bit meek. We are a little bit insular, internally looking, and I think we need to challenge that in ourselves personally, and we need to challenge that within the business community. It's not about necessarily just creating export businesses. Anyone can carry a brand through for instance, their online presence, whatever else it might be, but we have to better understand what that brand looks like in the 21st century. and a very personal perspective, we need to understand what 21st century Wales looks like, because it doesn't look like the Wales of the 20th century. And that, in many ways, that's a painful transition, but in many ways, that's really, really positive. So I would like to see a sort of an emulation of the sort of Scottish confidence, this notion of a smart, small, successful nation. That's something we can absolutely sort of latch on to, and relate to. But we're not a Scotland, we're not an Ireland, we are a Wales. And that has to be distinctive to us, and it has to be distinctive elsewhere in the in the world. So I think, we do see, particularly among tourist businesses, they want to better understand the brand, and they want to better be able to use the brand, because it's a real brand, it's a real asset. We have a lot to be cheering about in Wales. We tend not to cheer enough, but I think whether we like it or not, post-Brexit, we are going to have to work harder on projecting whatever that agreed brand is. So we're going to have to be bolder and brassier about what Wales means. But to start that, we need to figure out for ourselves what it means. I think it's a real opportunity. It's a really great business opportunity in that, to populate that narrative of what do we mean, what do we look like as an economy, what do we look like as a community of businesses. But it is part of a wider social conversation about what Wales means in the 21st century. But I think, again, I'm optimistic. I'm excited by the fact that if I look at just some of the examples of where Wales has pitched itself, whether it's through things like Champions League, and it's created the opportunity to project itself, I think we need to capitalise on that better.
Ben Cottam, thanks very much for joining us, and best of luck for the future.
Thanks very much.